Not just because my skin tone's a little browner from being in the sun for a vacation. Not just because I finished my master's and I'm feeling like an educated person. Not just because I have a loving family, great congregation in front of me. And not because many years ago I got through a really tough chronic illness and I'm coming out of the other end of it and feeling healthy and vibrant and alive. Boy, I feel blessed. But there are some mornings when I wake up and I don't feel blessed. And I have to consciously take a moment to make that choice. The choice that Shubenacadie Sam had this morning. The choice to see and gaze at my shadow, or to look up into the sky and see the light. This reminds me of a movie.
This is pitiful. 1,000 people freezing their butts off waiting to worship a rat. What a hype. Not like they used to mean something in this town. They used to pull the hog out and they used to eat it. You're hypocrites. All of you. You got a problem with what I'm saying, Larry? Untie your tongue and you come out here and talk, huh? Well, I'm sending you, princess. You know, you want a prediction about the weather. You're asking the wrong pill. I'll give you a winter prediction. It's going to be cold. It's going to be gray. And it's going to last you the rest of your life.
Who's seen that movie? Oh, good. It's a great, great show. We see it, we have a copy of it, and we watch it probably once a year. Bill Murray, he's a grumpy old guy. He's not very nice. And the girl, Andy in the movie, she doesn't like him at all. He thinks she's pretty great. So what happens to him is that after this day, he wakes up and guess what day it is again? Groundhog Day. And then the next day when he falls asleep, he has to deal with the fact that this day keeps repeating himself. And at first he's shocked. The next he says, hey, I know what kind of lotto tickets are going to be won. I know I can get to know this guy over here and exploit his weaknesses. And he becomes, he lives this day in so many different ways. But then he starts thinking, this is hell. I have to get up every morning and listen to this radio announcer make the same jokes. I have to be the person I am. And he realizes how terrible he is. And then he starts to kill himself. And the show shows him every Groundhog Day trying to come up with a new way of ending his life. But the next morning at 6:30, that buzzer goes off and he wakes up again. And this story of Bill Murray, takes time for him to grow into himself, time to learn about different ways of being, time to start caring about everybody in the community. He still tries to pick up this girl, Andy. He still fails miserably until he finally lets go, finally falls in love with her. I'm ruining this for you. But I got it to get the point across. He becomes a different person. And he loves her, and he comes to love everybody in the community. And he becomes the type of person that Micah talks about, the prophet. He starts seeking justice, loving kindness. And he starts walking humbly. And in that kind of action, Andy sits back and in one full day falls in love with him towards the end of the show, when she couldn't stand him 24 hours previous. And it's then that his life lives on. So we have these two beautiful readings. I'm so lucky to preach today. I've got this wonderful Micah reading that is kind of like the bumper sticker message of the Old Testament. It's the kind of the golden rule that you could put on the back of your car. And then we've got this, the Beatitudes. Beata meaning blessed the in Latin. And how many people have seen the Beatitudes on people's walls? Kind of garish, sort of there for you, many a needlepoint. And it's there. It's a treasure. We read it in funerals. We read it in weddings. We love this reading. For Micah, this ethics to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly takes place in what we see as a court scene. So we have the mountains watching and this prophet there and saying, okay, God, lay out your issue. And God says, you guys, you're being selfish. You're not acting like I want you to. In the context of Micah, he's living with in a time where the Jewish people are doing really well and maybe aren't so humble. And he says, God says, guys, remember how I loved you? Remember how I brought you across the Jordan? And we had such a bonding time. Why can't you remember Moses? Why can't you remember all those great people? And then Israel speaks back, and Israel says, well, God, why? What do you want from me? We're being successful here. We're doing well. What do you want? Burnt offerings? Heck, do you want my firstborn? When I read that to my husband, he said, boy, he said, you'd never hear me say that. He said, the last thing I'd fight to the death for my firstborn. What's with that? I said, there's not, wait. What does God say to that? And so then I kept reading, and he's like, oh, he doesn't want the firstborn. And I said, no. God comes back and says, no, I just want you to seek justice, love, kindness, and walk humbly with me. It's beautiful that God measures justice by how well the most vulnerable are doing in our society. That the exploitative policies that generate wealth at the expense of the vulnerable, he says, are not what he's looking for or she's looking for. God says, don't be selfish. Don't forget about my generosity. And in doing so, we can see a transformative virtue rise in your life. This picture is a church, a Catholic church on the Mount of the Beatitudes in Israel. And I love taking you on my trip to Israel with me. This is a beautiful church. I'll just take you through what it looks like. You come in, it's octagonal, and it was built in the 1939, I believe, in support by Mussolini to the Franciscan sisters. It's got gorgeous gardens. You can't see in this picture because it's kind of gray, but right in front of you is the Sea of Gennesaret, which is the Sea of Galilee. There's a monastery, there's a farm, there's a place. You can see people gathered there. And we sat, and our guide and our teacher read the Sermon on the Mount to us in this place. This is, as we're entering in, one of the sisters was there prepping for communion, and I peeked in, and she was, she's just so beautiful, just going about doing her work. And I put out my camera and I said, this, and she goes, and she smiled and she had a picture taken. There was amazing mosaics in the church. And on the walls are also the Stations of the Cross as you go around. Took this picture for my husband, sent it to him by email. And here, even there, that's the field in front of it. And this is where I sat pondering that Jesus, they're not 100% sure of the exact location of this, but it's just after Jesus heals the multitudes, and he's got this huge crowd, and he's sitting there, and all of these people around him, and they're saying, "Teach us, teacher. This is amazing what you're living. Let us know a little bit more about what you're doing." And it's there that he speaks the Beatitudes. He teaches. What we don't realize is that the Beatitudes are very, very similar to the book of Isaiah. And being a Jewish person at the time, if you read Isaiah, you hear the echoings that Matthew uses between these Beatitudes in this book. And so it's not something new that Jesus is bringing per se. He's using the old, but speaking through the context of his time and the context of his understanding of the law. It's here that I kind of fell in love with Jesus. I loved him. I loved what he stood for. But here in this spot, overlooking this lake, this message, this poetic, beautiful message, the realization that when I read it, I really perceived it impractically. I was like, I just don't know if I can live that way. It's here that I realized that God wasn't actually necessarily saying that I have to be perfect, that I have to be a saint, that I have to live like this. Gosh, God doesn't call us to mourn. But God does say, if you are ill, if you are mourning, if you are weak, if you are sick, you are blessed anyway. I love you no matter what state you're in. I love you if you're like Bill Murray in Groundhog Day, where you can't see the sun, where you're gazing at the shadow of life. And I'm also there with you whether or not you're living, feeling blessed, feeling high on life. I am there with you. It's not an imperative to ask you to live that way, although Jesus embodies all of these qualities and we try to embody and be like Jesus, but it is a promise. I do admire the instruction, but I do fear the implications. The implications of living a life turned on its head when in our communities the wealthy, the wise, the strong succeed. It's a bit scary. But there are people like Pete Seeger. We're going to sing a song that he helped make famous after the sermon. A guy who was a civil rights activist, vocal government critic, protest singer, and an amazing environmentalist. He was courageous. I think you could probably say he embodied all of Micah's qualities that he says God encourages us to be. He was no groundhog. I'm going to say this too. Stephen, you were so courageous. You gotta look at the CTV interview. Stephen, you were no groundhog. God asks us to see this alternative vision of community. And that we can look at each other as worthy, not because of status, not because of virtue of our own achievement, but because God chooses to be be on the side of the weak, the forgotten, the despised, the justice seekers, the peacemakers, those who stand up for prostitutes, those who may be persecuted because of their beliefs. In this beautiful passage, we can hear God say, "You are blessed." And God is speaking, not just in that context, but directly to us in our time too. We can recognize that our neighbors share our humanity. They invite us to see God's love in a new light, bending our understanding of the world. We hear God's call of welcome. Remember, liberate. And like Bill Murray Groundhog Day, he shows us that living into the spirit of the Beatitudes with a commitment and compassion is something that we can all do. In that process, we discover that this is not an irrational request at all. And through Micah, we can also discover a vision that sees the ethical world not as a threat,